And well, my presentation, it's called When the Mummy is Digital, Preservation and Dissemination. I chose this title because I don't want to be polemic, but I will start with a slide that tries to explain all the premises about me that made me to choose this title and, of course, the contents of my presentation. I'm a computer scientist. I am also a teacher that teaches computer science. I work in an online, purely virtual university, so I love virtual learning environments, repositories, etc. And in fact, I have a lot of friends who are librarians, and I want to keep them. So what I mean is that even though this presentation may seem that I don't like repositories, etc., it's not the fact. It's the contrary. It's that I am like devil's advocate, just saying at least how things should be from my humble opinion. So, learning object repositories or digital repositories, I will mix these terms from time to time, are a very important part of virtual learning environments. And in fact, my main interest in this whole scenario is analyzing what users do with this setting and then trying to reintroduce this information into the system for building personalization, personalized systems, etc. And well, the thing is that one of the big discussions in the recent years was about learning objects. It was like two worlds colliding here. From one side, computer scientists, from the other, the pedagogists. We couldn't even reach a single definition for what a learning object is. And now we have another world colliding. It's the repositories one that come from people from information science, librarians, etc. So, well, when we talk about learning object repositories, it's not really a simple issue. So, what are the main goals for a digital repository? Both words were in the title of the presentation: preservation and dissemination. The idea is that we want to keep the mummy forever, and we want also at the same time showing the mummy. But what I think, in my opinion, these goals are somehow contradictory. You cannot do both things at the same time, at the same level. In fact, what is a repository? If you go to a dictionary and ask for the meaning of the word, a repository is a place or a container in which things can be stored for safety. Also, it's a place of burial, a sepulcher. But also, at the same time, it's a place where things are kept for exhibition and use. So it's at the same time for dissemination, for preservation, and for dissemination. This is a repository. It's I wouldn't say digital, I would say a stone repository or physical repository. And in fact, I think it's, this idea of the mummy came from, about discussing that it's very difficult to build a repository right now using open source tools, etc. For me as a teacher, so it was like for the Egyptians building the pyramid. And in fact, the pyramid was built for keeping the pharaoh for ages. In fact, they failed because it was spoiled several times. But I think that the idea of repository is very well represented by this huge and solid structure. But at the same time, what we want is, okay, the repository or the pyramid is nice, but what we want is just to show the world all the treasures inside the pyramid, and in fact, not only show them, but even allow people to touch them, to take them to their homes, to show them to other people, etc. But that is one of the main problems, that as physical objects, we cannot do that. So, the repository, I think the pyramid was built with preservation in mind, mostly, and dissemination was not really the main part of the question. What I think is that we should turn this coin and make dissemination more important than preservation. So, what is the current situation of digital repositories? I repeat, in my opinion, and we would like to. I will be very happy to discuss that with you after the session. We live in a content of abundance. Quoting Brian or even David Wiley, that he's also here, everybody is publishing open educational resources right now. MIT started doing it a few years ago. Of course, there were some examples before that, but it was like the kickoff meeting for the OER movement. But the main question now, I think, is who is reusing these open educational resources? We have no track of this use, and what we are trying to build, and I will try to show you in this presentation, is how to promote this reusing. We have very successful examples about repositories. The Open Courseware Consortium, Merlot, even though Merlot has no content inside, just links to other repositories, but are good examples. But on the other hand, we also can find not so successful examples about repositories such as Carrillo, that because of lack of funding, finished stored in a room. Well, let's see that I will not discuss what did happen, why did happen, but it's not that just setting up a repository means that you are going to be successful. And in fact, what I see as a teacher that tries to arrange contents for his students is that repositories now are mostly institutional, mostly for preservation and for positioning. By positioning, I mean that telling the whole world how good I am, here you have my resources, if you want to use them, it's free, they are free, you can do it, but in fact, I don't care about what you do with my resources because I don't have even the single chance to know what you are doing with my resources. And these repositories are managed by librarians. And I don't say that it shouldn't be this way. What I say is that this is the current situation, at least in my university, the Open University of Catalonia, but also in other universities as well. Now we are living in an age that, well, we have the digital thing, the open thing, and the 4Rs thing. By digital, it's a very good change. Bim also, in his keynote presentation this morning, he also explained that the fact that things are digital makes the application and scaling very cost efficiently. We can make exact copies of the mummy, in this case, without harming the original. So everybody can take a copy and take it home and do whatever, even modify it and change it, whatever. We are also in the middle of a very strong open movement. We are trying to achieve a state where all the resources, we have the freedom to access them, to copy them, to modify them, and to redistribute them. This is, I think, something that all of us that we are here in this conference agree with, this idea of openness. And the 4Rs, as stated by David Wiley, is like we need to pursue reusing things, revising things, remixing, and redistributing. That is the power of final users. I use final users, but actually I should use this word like prosumers, because we don't want to be like, from an institutional point of view, just to provide content, being producers, and then from the other side, our learners or final users just being consumers. We would like to create a community of prosumers. So, in my opinion, in my very humble opinion as a teacher, the main problems is that I cannot decide what to put in an open repository, even if it's open. And I have an open repository in my institution, but I ask them, okay, can I have my equations there, my formulas, my data? They told me, no, you cannot. And sometimes the reason is very naive. For example, why cannot have an equation in my repository? Because you have no title for the equation, or maybe you don't have an author for the equation. And we need that for preservation issues. So we need, as librarians, everything has an author, everything has a title, etc., etc. I know it might sound stupid, but and of course it's not the reason, but it was one of the things we had to discuss at the beginning. The other issue, very important for us, is that the repository, in fact, is just another tool of the virtual learning environment. It's not integrated in the learning process. We ask our students to go there to find resources and then come back to the classroom. So it's like I don't want that. I want the repository to be in the classroom, or on the contrary, I want the repository to be the classroom. And we are trying to do that. Another thing is that both searching and browsing for resources are completely unrelated to what users do with such resources at the end. So I can ask my students, go to the repository, find a resource that you find it's valuable to you, and then use it. But what do I mean by use it? I cannot even explain that. So imagine my students, they read it, but they don't, I don't know if they are learning from that experience or not. And the last one is that we are now in the 21st century. Retro is fine, vintage is fine, but the space is not. And we are using the space as a tool. And why? Well, in my institution, the answer was because we were already using it, and this is the technology that the university chose for storing things, so please stick to this space. Okay, I will do it. So, what we think is that learning object repositories should be thematic rather than institutional. I would like to have more small repositories around several subjects, of course, connected to each other with distributed or federated searching, whatever. That doesn't mean that you need to go one by one. And not only repositories are connected, but also the learning objects or open educational resources within the repository are also connected to each other. And in fact, the searching and browsing should be contextualized to the subject or the thematic of the repository. For my students, author, title, and date are useless. They don't use that for searching resources. If they are trying to find resources about the statistics, they will probably just do searches using a taxonomy or whatever. And in fact, what we want is to promote the 4 R's among these final users, teachers and learners, that, as I said, I should use this term prosumers. And in fact, the ideal scenario is that the learning object repository becomes the seed for a learning community around a topic. So, a proposal is just use the repository as a backend, build a taxonomy-based visual user interface. This was part of another project that I'm glad to say that we started discussing this idea with Brian 2 years ago. We can access OERs through these permanent URIs, that, for example, the handles in the space, that's a good thing of this space. And what we would like to add is a set of services on top of this repository. And of course, as I said at the beginning, my main concern is capturing, analyzing, and reintroducing all this knowledge generated during these interactions into the system itself. So, this is the ideal architecture of the repository. You have the repository in one side, hidden from the users. Every user, we have like this clever user interface. I don't know how it is. Maybe I will discover it in the future, but get the idea that converts the repository into a social layer where all my students interact with each other, and each student sees this PIM. It's like a personal information management repository that is a very small part of the repository. They only see what they want to see. They don't see the whole repository. And every learning object has on top of it a set of services that you can use for improving the usage of the system. And services are not very complicated. It's just as easy as adding a comment to a resource, making a question there, rating a resource, saying it's fine, or I like it, I don't like it, making it favorite or starring it, like in Google Reader, tagging with your own words, sharing through all your social networks or even in your classroom, and of course subscribing to it. Just you are able to know what other learners like you are doing with such a repository. The expected benefits are that learners can integrate OERs into their learning process, teachers can analyze the quality of OERs and better understand what are the needs of learners. System managers can provide better services through this, by analyzing this usage, and OERs get continuously improved. So, what are we? Well, we have a very small repository, a space-based one on statistics. You have the address here. It's for experimentation purposes, so our students are told that things change from day to day, so they know that more than a learning tool for them, it's a learning tool for me as a researcher in this subject. And we have now a few hundred resources, but we have thousands waiting to be ingested, and that's very costly and very expensive. We are already defining the information architecture of the repository itself, and we are now storing all the interaction within the learning objects itself. We are building a reputation scheme for OERs, so searching and browsing use this reputation scheme to recommend resources. We are also developing a visual user interface using actually the ideas from the Maze project that Wim mentioned this morning, and we discussed it with Ryan. And we are also starting to modify the display score to include these services. So, well, conclusions maybe is not the right word for this slide, but well, I think that, and I say it again, from my opinion, repository should be designed for final users. That means learners and teachers, or at least take them into account. Users should be able to provide feedback, because this feedback can be used to improve both the repository and both the contents. And well, Wim also said the same this morning, that with this idea of rich media channels, we are in the process of trying to connect the repository to other channels. And I finish with this. It's the idea, I cannot ask my students to go where the repository is. I need to bring the repository where my learners are. And if my learners are in Facebook, or are in 20, or are in Twitter, or are in the P2P networks, why cannot them find resources there? So it's what we try with all this idea. And that's all. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be really glad to answer your questions.
We have a few minutes for questions just for Julià. Anyone has any? Well, then I will start with one. You said you were going to adapt the DSpace code. Are you crazy?
Yeah, actually, we know that it's not an easy issue. In fact, we contacted two experts, Gareth Waller and Bob Stantz, that have been working with Scott Leslie, as you know, with doing these things, using this space for learning objects, not for just prints or whatever. And the main thing is that we already started doing that with the space, and we started with 1.5.1, the version, and when we finished the first very beta version of our software, this space came like the 1.6, so it was okay, throw everything away and start again. And that's the main problem, that we cannot keep the pace of the community of developers, so what we need is just to find a way of how working with the community of developers of this space and telling them that our ideas are good, why don't they help us to develop these ideas, and then maybe, but of course, we are crazy, but I think that all the open movement is created by crazy people, so why not stick to that?
Anyone else? Well, then I'll ask one more question. So you said at one point you don't think it is necessarily your role to decide what goes into the repository. Did I understand that? Whose role do you think?
No, on the contrary.
Oh, sorry.
I mean, well, it's because of my English, don't worry, it's my fault. The thing is that as a teacher, maybe I think that a specific learning object should be in the repository. And it's not that easy. I understand that for preservation issues, you need to do some quality procedures in order to be sure that that will be useful for the institution. But for me as a teacher, if I need an equation in the middle of the repository, I would like to have it there, link it to the other resources. And now it's not possible because, well, so many issues. Starting for the title, but also that the equation was in a text file, and I wanted to my learners to have the text file linked to an image representing the equation, and that was not possible at that moment. But I mean, it's a question of time. I'm sure that we will be able to do it.
Right.
She's one of the librarians I mentioned in my first slide. That's my fight every day.
And talking about the services of the on top, we are developing it now, so and
I hope so. I mean, I'm waiting for that.
Okay.